Good afternoon, I'm Gregor Aiken and this is UWS News, bringing you a general election special. Today we'll be taking a look at your constituency, we'll be asking if politicians can be trusted and we'll hear from First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. But first, your headlines. Tipping point for Labour as latest Ayrshire polls suggest an SNP constituency takeover. And is there a lack of trust in our politicians? First Minister Nicola Sturgeon voices her concern after new figures released shows that just 16% of Britons trust politicians to tell the truth. The general election is expected to be one of the most unpredictable in decades. So what does this mean for Ayr? We sent our reporter Simon Thornton to find out.
This is Ayr, the Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock constituency. And for 20 years this has been a Labour seat. But that could be about to change. The latest polls from both Lord Ashcroft and Comres show a vast swing towards the SNP, making this one of Scotland's decisive seats that could affect the whole of Britain. The bookies too have slashed the odds for an SNP takeover here.
Well, obviously the polls are not looking good at the moment, but the only poll that matters is a poll on the 7th of May, and we are working hard and fighting for every single vote.
In 2010, Labour won a landslide victory, with 47% of the vote. The Liberal Democrats came in last, and the poll shows their support falling to 2%. But their candidate, Richard Brodie, says he's certain he can achieve more than that. The SNP only managed to reach third place in 2010, but the latest poll sees a swing of 20% from Labour to the SNP. That could make the SNP's Corrie Wilson the first new MP here for 20 years.
I mean, it goes back to what I've said. I think for a long while people have just voted for one party or the other, and if you're in that scenario then and you've been lucky for the last few elections, then you kind of get a bit complacent and you sort of think, well, I don't need to try too hard because I'm just automatically going to get this, and that's why it's an exciting election this time, because that's not a given anymore.
The swing is bad news for the Conservatives as well as Labour. Despite having a Conservative MSP here in John Scott, they could slide into third place.
I think we've moved on quite a bit from the Ashcroft poll already. When we're round the doors, we're finding people are saying that they've voted Labour for a long time, they're not voting Labour this time. Just this once for the sake of the Union, they're prepared to come to the Conservatives because they trust the Union with the Conservatives. We're the only party to trust with the Union.
So what does this all mean for the UK? Well, a swing from Labour to the SNP could do one of two things. The Labour leader, Jim Murphy, says it could ensure another 5 years of Conservative rule, but the SNP say it will lead to an SNP-Labour coalition. One thing is certain, the race to number 10 is sure to be a close one. Simon Thornton, UWS News, Ayr.
It certainly will. Now, polling figures released by Ipsos Mori show that there is a low and long-lasting distrust for politicians. The research shows that the worst point in 2009, only 13% of people trusted politicians. Speaking to UWS News, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon voiced her opinions.
Well, I think it's for people to look at the different parties and different candidates and decide, whether those that have been doing the job for, the main Westminster parties have contributed to that lack of trust. Westminster appears all too often to be run for the vested interests and not for ordinary people. I want to see Scotland's voice be heard much more loudly in Westminster, and I want to see MPs there that do work and campaign for and work for the interests of ordinary people, not just in Scotland but across the UK, rather than stand up for the vested interests and the powers of the establishment.
In the studio, we have former Private Secretary of the Leader of the SNP, Ewan Crawford. Ewan, thanks for joining us today. Ewan, do you believe there is a lack of trust between politicians and the public?
Well, clearly politicians, not just in Scotland and perhaps not just in the UK, but across much of Western democracies, are suffering from a lack of trust. I think the situation is so bad that politicians are bracketed with estate agents and indeed journalists at the low end of people's trust. But clearly it is a big issue. If there's a disconnect between politicians and the people they seek to serve, that's a problem, and it's something that politicians from all parties need to address.
So why do you think this?
Well, I think, and interestingly, recently, I think there's been a general decline in trust with people in authority. If you look even at the situation with The banks, traditionally, you think of your bank manager as someone that you would trust. You think of newspapers, clearly the issues with Leveson, and politicians, certain scandals recently clearly haven't helped there. In some respect, it's quite good to have a healthy distrust of politicians. You don't want them to be too remote or too reified. You do want to have a healthy distrust, but I do wonder now if we've got rather unhealthy distrust. Although I have to say, in Scotland, of course, with the huge engagement there was during the independence referendum, whatever side you were on, hopefully that's starting to close the gap between elected representatives and the general public as a whole.
What should politicians be doing to address this feeling of mistrust?
Well, I suppose one of the things they should do most obviously is perhaps keep promises that they make during election campaign. You have very high profile, for example, Liberal Democrat promised before the last election to abolish tuition fees in England, and when they got into power they actually raised them to £9,000. Now, the Liberal Democrats will argue that that was the right policy, but I think the issue, of course, is that's perhaps what they should have been saying before the election. So clearly there is a perception, rightly or wrongly, certainly rightly in the instance I just mentioned, that politicians don't always fulfil the promises that they make during election time.
The polls suggest that the SNP might win more seats in London than ever before. Could this change the public's perception of Westminster politics?
You mean that the SNP could win more seats at Westminster, the House of Commons, in this election? Well, yes, and indeed it's quite interesting at the moment. If you listen to what Nicola Sturgeon and other senior SNP figures are saying, they're talking about a progressive alliance across the UK. So they're making it very clear that this isn't a rerun of the independence campaign, that the issue is who's going to govern. And at this election, there's every possibility that the SNP, although not in a formal government, in a formal coalition at Westminster, could be exerting an influence. So clearly there is an attempt to try and reassure people perhaps across the rest of the UK that the SNP is a progressive force.
Thank you very much, Ian. That is all from UWS News Politics Special. Goodbye.